Peter, in trying to discern whether or not God exists, I've been fascinated by the ontological argument, which initially I thought was a joke. But after thinking about it, reading things that you wrote, among others, I no longer think it's a joke. But I'd love you to explain it in its richness.
The argument, called the ontological argument, may not be one argument. There are a lot of versions of it. I won't take a position on the question whether they're all the same argument, but anyway, here are two arguments that have been called the ontological argument. The name, by the way, was invented by Kant in the 18th century. These are earlier arguments. One of them was devised by one Anselm, later Archbishop of Canterbury, still later Saint Anselm. He was rough contemporary of the son of William the Conqueror. And he put the argument this way. He said, well, imagine the fool in the Psalm, in the 14th Psalm, who says there is no God. He's just contradicting himself. That was the conclusion of the argument. A very strong sense, just as strong as the sense in which he would be contradicting himself if he said there is a God and there isn't one. Or I have a rectangular house that has 6 sides. Although, of course, those contradictions are obvious enough that you don't need an argument to draw them out. But the contradiction is supposed to go like this. First of all, we must suppose he has the proper meaning for the word God. You know, if he means by God something improper, like an old man who lives in the sky and shoots lightning bolts, he may be right to say there is no God. But the proper meaning for the word God is a something than which no greater can be conceived. All right, so what he's saying is a something than which no greater can be conceived exists. But wait, of course the thing exists in his own mind, in his own thought. What he's really saying, said Anselm, is a something than which no greater can be conceived does not exist in reality, external to the mind, not just in the mind, but in reality. Well, suppose that were right. Then he'd be saying that this thing just exists in his mind, that the something than which no greater can be conceived exists only internal to his own mind. And here's the contradiction. But then we could conceive of a thing greater than this something than which no greater could be conceived, namely the same thing or something just like it existing in reality, because obviously it's greater to exist in reality than it is simply to exist in the mind. That's a very elaborate argument. 500 years later or so, René Descartes gave a much simpler argument, but it's also, at least simpler to follow, it's also classified as a version of the ontological argument, and it was this. God, we think of, if we have the proper idea of God, we think of him as a supremely perfect being. And that means a being whose nature contains all perfections. But existence is a perfection. It's better to exist than not to exist. So God's nature must contain existence, but then his nature is inseparable from existence, just as the nature of a triangle is inseparable from having interior angles that add up to 180 degrees, so right triangle. Then the nature of God is inseparable from existence. So you can't think of God as not existing. So when the atheist says God doesn't exist, he's contradicting himself, because he's saying that a being that has existence as part of his nature does not exist, not a possible thing to say. Well, those sound a lot. You can see why people would say they were the same argument.
Now, one can think that you can substitute anything for that definition of God and prove anything exists.
Yeah, you would think so. You could define an Egmont as an existent golden mountain, right? Well, then it has existence as part of its nature. Descartes was well aware of that objection. It was communicated to him in his own lifetime. Indeed, very powerful criticisms of the argument were given to Anselm and Descartes by exasperated contemporaries who said, you can't possibly prove the existence of anything this way. They both resisted them. what Descartes actually said in response to, well, you can build existence into anything and then prove the existence of anything, because after, obviously, if an existent golden mountain exists, then a golden mountain exists. I don't understand Descartes' reply. It had to do with something about the unity of the concept and the adventitious way in which existence might be contained in a concept as opposed to a real way, but it's not something I can make any sense of in the end.
Well, then Kant supposedly had the ultimate refutation.
Right. Actually, he had two ultimate refutations. One went like this. You can't build existence into a concept. We're talking about Descartes' version now, but you might adapt this to Anselm if you took existence and reality in place of existence and what I'm saying. You can't build existence into a concept because a concept is made of properties or attributes or qualities, things a feature can have, and existence isn't a thing a feature can have. Existence is rather all the features a thing has coming together in that one thing. And that's why you get the wrong result when you try to build existence into a concept and ask whether it's separable from the concept or not. You simply can't define it that way. And that's the famous thing that Descartes said. He actually said something else which I think is more profound, which is, well, of course a non-existent God is a contradiction in terms, but then a non-existent golden mountain is a contradiction in terms either. After all, couldn't possibly exist, right? And if something couldn't possibly exist, it's a contradiction in terms. But that doesn't prove that a golden mountain exists just because a non-existent golden mountain is a contradiction in terms. I like that as a refutation of Descartes' argument much better than the other, because the first one you could substitute necessary existence for existence. And necessary existence does seem to be something that's a property and can be contained in the concept of something. For example, many people have said that necessary existence is contained in the concept of God, although they've said God doesn't exist.
It is assumed that for several hundred years, Kant's refutation of the ontological argument held, but in recent decades, it's reemerged.
Well, at least an argument that it seems reasonable to call the ontological argument has reemerged. I'm not sure it's the same one. And in fact, it is an argument that contains no logical mistake. It's called the modal argument, and it proceeds like this. In fact, the only way to get the argument straight in our heads, I think, is to think in terms of possible worlds. Ways things might be, all the possible ways reality could be. Now, suppose that we define God as a being that, as Descartes did, as a being that has all perfections. Obviously, one of the perfections is necessary existence. It's better to exist necessarily. You're nearer to being a perfect being if you exist necessarily than if your existence is a mere accident. All right, so that's one premise of the argument, that it's part of the concept of God that he's necessarily existent. The argument has only one other premise, that God is possible. Now, normally, possibility of existence doesn't entail existence, right? It might be possible for there to be a 10,000 carat diamond, but in fact, there is none. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it exists. But consider, if God is possible, then he exists in some possible world. But then in some possible world, there exists something that exists in every possible world. So he must exist in this world, in our world, in the actual world, because if he didn't exist here, he wouldn't be necessarily existent there. This too sounds like a trick. I assure you it's not a trick. I mean, I did leave a certain logical nicety out. That's true, but it's not, what I left out doesn't amount to any kind of trick or fallacy in the way I presented the argument. It's perfectly logically valid in the sense that, granted the premises, the conclusion follows. The only question is, why accept the premise that God is possible? That's what proponents of this modal ontological argument are never able to answer. They're never able to give any reason why we should think God is possible. The atheist hearing this argument should just say, oh, I see that God doesn't simply fail to exist. I see that he couldn't possibly exist. And indeed, some atheists have said that.
So at the end of the day, when you look at the ontological argument, how does that enrich our understanding of the potential existence of God?
I think it shows that you can't think of God as somebody who simply happens not to exist. Everything else that doesn't exist, at least in the world, in the concrete world of causation that we have around us, I'm not talking about numbers or mathematical things like that, might not have existed. God would be unique in that if he doesn't exist, it's because he can't possibly exist, and if he does exist, he couldn't possibly not exist.